All right, let's talk about your dive gear, your literal lifeline when you're underwater. But here's the thing, are you treating it like one? If you're like most divers I know, probably not. And trust me, that can be a huge problem. In today's video, I'm sharing the steps I've learned from diving all over the world and learning from others to keep my gear in great condition. And I'm talking about diving in some pretty wild conditions. This is the stuff that can save your life, or at least save you from shelling out cash for new gear when it falls apart prematurely. Okay, would you believe your dive gear could be quietly falling apart as we speak? If you're planning your next underwater adventure, how confident are you that it'll be in good shape for the dive? Let me show you what could be happening to your gear in storage, and more importantly, how you can stop it. Imagine your favorite wetsuit, Regulator, or BCD slowly rusting away, its integrity slipping away thanks to an invisible enemy, salt. Yep, that same salt that makes the ocean so beautiful is also quietly destroying your gear. Don't get me wrong, saltwater diving is incredible. But without proper care, that salty environment can really mess up your gear. The real issue isn't just the immediate damage, it's the long-term cumulative destruction that's truly concerning. Saltwater in particular degrades all metals through a combination of moisture, salt, and oxygen through a process called oxidation, which causes rust. This combination corrodes the metal, growing the rust continuously over time, making the metal more brittle until its integrity collapses. By removing moisture, salt, or oxygen, rust growth can be stopped. Even freshwater has particles, silt, and gunk that, while not corrosive, can still seriously cause clogging in your gear. Now you're probably thinking, but I rinse my gear after every dive. Isn't that enough? Well, yes and no. Unfortunately, it's not always sufficient, especially when you're doing repetitive dives. Salt and gunk buildup can occur rapidly, and if not addressed properly, it can lead to equipment failure at the worst possible moments. Let's put this into perspective with an important statistic. Equipment failure is behind around 10% of diving accidents, with many of these failures linked to poor cleaning and bad maintenance practices. Therefore, proper gear care is no joke. But here's the good news. Preventing this silent destroyer of your dive gear is entirely within your control. The key lies in understanding how to properly maintain your gear between repetitive dives, especially in saltwater environments. By implementing the right cleaning routine, not only can you extend the life of your expensive equipment, but also potentially your own. It's not just about rinsing, it's about getting into those hard to reach places where salt likes to hide. Do it and you'll ensure the reliability of your equipment when you need it most. And by the way, your regulator isn't just another piece of gear, it's your underwater lifeline. It's literally how you breathe underwater. But are you treating it like the life-saving device that it is? Your regulator is a masterpiece of engineering, designed to deliver air from your tank at the right pressure for safe breathing underwater. But this precision comes at a price. It's incredibly sensitive to contamination. Even a tiny grain of salt or a drop of moisture in the wrong place can compromise its function, causing eventual capability of free-flowing at the worst of moments. In case you're not familiar with the term free-flowing, that means when air starts bubbling from your regulator without you actually breathing from it. It's free-flowing. The first stage is especially vulnerable. It's responsible for reducing the high pressure air from your tank to an intermediate pressure. If moisture sneaks in here, you're looking at potential corrosion and malfunction. That's why it's crucial to avoid soaking the first stage in water during cleaning. And here's a pro tip. When you're diving, make sure you attach your regulator to your tank in a dry spot, away from any saltwater splashes. And if there is potential for saltwater splash, be sure to open your tank a tiny bit first to blow out the saltwater from the connection area, then attach it to your regulator. You want to prevent salt water from getting into that regulator, or really any moisture at all. You don't need to always blow it off, but it is good to clear the salt water away if it has been obviously splashed. You can also just rinse it off while pressurized as well with clean water. This is a perfect way of rinsing off your regulator. If you do have to take it off your tank, then you can secure the dust cap over the first stage inlet after blowing it with air to remove salt water. The thing is, you don't want salt water to be corroding these threads, which is quite common, so try and keep the salt water off those threads as much as possible. This small step prevents moisture from entering the delicate internal mechanisms, and those threads staying easy to screw in. And I already mentioned it a little bit, but while you're rinsing your gear with fresh water, pay special attention to the second stage, where salt water buildup can affect performance. This removes the coat of salt that will slowly start corroding the metal. Some may submerge your regulator in fresh water for thorough rinsing, but even with a dust cap, I usually don't submerge my first stage in water. Just rinse it externally. You do want to make sure you rinse it fairly well, but don't try and get water inside of it. It's important to get all of the metal rinsed with fresh water, and that's the highest corrosive risk, especially around the small little nooks and crannies. And if you have little guards around your hoses like this, just go ahead and pull these back from the metal, expose the metal. In fact, you can always leave them here. Some like to cut them off, but that's entirely optional. But the thing is, you don't want to just leave these here all the way up, because what will happen is you might forget to rinse this part. So my recommendation would be to just go ahead and pull these back permanently. You don't need to cut them off, but just don't ever put them back. And this just makes this area, which is sensitive to corrosion, easier to rinse for the long run. And if you do want to make sure you're thorough, maybe you had a long week of lots of dives and you really want to get the salt water off, you can submerge this thing. But what I would do is attach your first stage to a pressurized tank, turn on the tank so that it's pressurized, of course, and then you can submerge everything in water and just let it soak there for several hours. But keep it pressurized, and this will make sure that water doesn't enter the delicate first stage. One big mistake I see numerous divers make is while rinsing, they press the purge button on their second stage, which can let water into the system, which is fine. That's fine to rinse if it's pressurized, but if it's not pressurized, like right now, nothing's happening. When I push this button and there's water will get inside the system, and that's not good. It's allowing moisture in there, potential for bacteria and corrosion. If it's pressurized, this can be helpful for cleaning this second stage, but only if it's still on a pressurized tank. Otherwise, avoid doing it and consider this option. And speaking of that longer storage after a week of diving, if you're heading home after a dive trip and potentially storing your equipment for a longer time, there's a more thorough cleaning process to follow. And aside from the thorough rinse I already talked about, we want to do this extra maintenance on your regulator at least yearly and sometimes more frequently if you're diving often locally. Now, this will be after you've already rinsed it and it's fairly cleaned with fresh water. Inspect it, let it dry out of the sun, and then inspect it for any signs of corrosion. It's very common to get corrosion around the connectors. If you have any little slots or screws, those often get corrosion. You can kind of see, even with my diligence of trying to clean these, I will get corrosion. So you will almost always get corrosion. It's just how fast, and you can remove the corrosion, which I'll get to here in a moment, at least yearly, and that's what I'm about to talk about. And so just check all the joints, see how they're doing, see if you have any major corrosion buildup. If you are seeing corrosion buildup, you probably want to consider doing this cleaning. And especially important is check the threads. The threads are a common culprit. You can honestly feel the threads, especially on DIN connectors. When you're screwing this into your tank, if it's kind of hard to screw in, you probably need to de-rust your threads, because the threads will almost always rust. It's like a constant battle to keep these things rust-free. So don't be hard on yourself, but when it's getting hard, it's time to clean them. you can use some aluminum and chrome safe cleaner to help remove the spots of rust on the bolts, threads, and various pieces of the gear, especially the joints. Look at those. You'll want some cloth or rough paper towels along with a soft toothbrush. Don't use a hard toothbrush. Those will scratch up your chrome to no end. And if you just kind of look here, you'll see a bunch of different pieces of chrome and usually aluminum. Often regulators often have chrome and aluminum. This one's also a titanium metal. You have to kind of think of the different metals that are there and make sure your cleaner is safe to use on all of them. Often chrome is the easiest one to destroy, so if something's chrome safe, it's usually fairly safe for other metals. Avoid brushing near O-rings and consider removing them to prevent damage to them. This is especially important on DIN connectors since the O-ring is right there. Of course, after the cleaning, you want to go ahead and replace the O-ring, and it's a good time to go ahead and put some grease on there, just enough to let it shine and put it in. And you'll find if you grease it too, it's a lot easier to put in as well. I do want to advise too, whatever cleaner you're using to de-rust this thing, make sure you read the cleaner appropriately. The directions and any instructions that come with it, they all have slightly different ways, and so the video would be like an hour long if I went through all the different cleaners. But in particular, you want to see if it's non-toxic to your skin. A lot of them tend to be not very safe to touch, so they advise you wear gloves, eye protection, and cover your mouth. So just in case there's a splash, it doesn't burn a hole in your eye, for example. And another thing, do not use steel rust remover on your regulator. Generally, there's not too much steel on your regulator because it is kind of a heavier and more durable metal. And generally, regulators will be a little bit lighter. But if you do have steel, I'd still recommend safer cleaner because of the rubber and other things. It'll probably pay off better. And so it'll be safer for the entire system. And steel rust remover tends to be the most heaviest duty stuff. So it's the stuff you have to be more careful about. It's like, especially like naval jelly. And it's also worth talking about how rust looks a little bit differently on the different metals. It's not consistent. I have some rust here, you can kind of see. You'll see it gets a little bit more dull. It kind of looks dull and it looks much less shiny. The chrome here is probably fine. It's still shiny, but you'll see a much more dulling effect as it begins to rust. On steel, rust will kind of be this orangish brownish color, and it kind of has a very distinct and kind of ugly look. No matter what, the rust is never pretty, but you can definitely see where that rust built up. And so depending on the color of the rust, you can kind of see, if it's steel or not. So that will give you a good idea of what cleaner to use. You could use a fairly non-invasive acid that is fairly household obtainable called vinegar. And so probably already have some vinegar, and I will say I tried vinegar and I'll show some clips of it. It works pretty well, but you will have to submerge things in it for quite some time. To get all the rust off of some steel, I had to pretty much submerge it in there for 3 days, and my entire bathroom smelled like vinegar for 3 days. So that's interesting. I do want to say that it works fairly well. I don't know how safe it is around hoses. You don't want to submerge your regulator in there. So it has limited uses. I used it for dive knives, and you could use it for dive torches, for example, or some rusty tools that you might want to see if you can get back into working condition. It works, but I think to my liking, maybe you've had different experiences with it. I think it took a little bit longer than I'd like, so I tend to use other things like naval jelly or this AluClean kind of stuff that works fairly nicely for a regulator and other parts of the gear that you might be able to get in there with a soft toothbrush. And as an added bonus, you won't smell like vinegar for a very long time. Also, just to make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's, double check your regulator manual to see if they have any specific cleaners they would like to be used on your regulator. Don't void your warranty if you don't have to. You can also disassemble your second stage into its components. This thing is entirely disassemblable, and you can put it back together for a thorough cleaning. Consider this optional though. Usually when you take it in for servicing, they will clean it out as well. So unless you're diving a lot in a particularly gunky area where this tends to be gunked up a lot and you're diving there frequently, It's generally not necessary if you're doing yearly maintenance on your regulator anyways. But potentially you could learn how to do that and save some money as well, as long as your first stage doesn't need servicing. I'll of course show some clips of me cleaning the gear, but one important note is that when you're getting in there with the toothbrush, just make sure you just go at those threads hard. Of course, remove that O-ring so you don't damage it. All the different joints, all the little nooks and crannies, and just make sure by the time you're done with it, it's nice and shiny afterwards, and try to get all that rust off. The threads are probably going to be the most annoying to get, and you're probably going to have to work those probably several times to get all the rust off. But it's entirely doable, and you can feel proud of yourself for, restoring your gear into pretty good condition. Before storing your gear long term, make sure everything is completely dry. Once dry, store your regulator in a cool, dry place without the direct sunlight. And before long-term storage, you want to double check your O-rings for damage. This is a good time to go ahead and grease up your O-rings as well. You can lubricate them with a good quality silicone grease, but make sure you use it sparingly. You just want it to really glisten a little bit with the light. I do want to mention that there are different types of lube that you can apply to your O-rings. For most divers, you're fine using cheaper off-the-shelf silicone lube, and you don't really need much at all, so that silicone lube will last a very long time. Just put some on your fingers, rub them together, and then take the O-ring and then start rubbing that O-ring with your fingers. By the end of it, you should see that it glistens and it appears shiny, but you shouldn't see any obvious buildup of grease on it. If you have buildup, make sure you wipe that away. You have too much. And that could attract particulates that will be bad for the O-ring and your system. So it's important to not have too much. If you use nitrox over 40% oxygen, your regulator will need a more expensive kind of grease that is oxygen safe, such as Crystal Lube or similar brands. That's not the standard for recreational diving, so it's very specialized, but I do want to mention it so you're aware of it. This special lube is needed because the extra oxygen creates flammability risk, and this particular grease, like Crystal Lube, is safe to use with oxygen over 40%. Just remember, if you plan to use your system with 40% or more oxygen, you probably need a high oxygen safe regulator, and you need to have used the right lube for it. Otherwise, it could be dangerous. That's, like I said, that's a rare case. If you're doing that kind of thing, you probably know what you're getting into. At least I hope you do. But I do want to mention it so you're aware. Your BCD, which is not just some fancy inflatable vest. It's your underwater life jacket and buoyancy control system, all rolled into one. It's an important piece of equipment that's particularly volatile corrosion and can cause some serious issues if things go wrong. Think of your BCD as a complex system with various parts. It's not just an air bladder. It's an intricate system of valves, inflators, materials that work together to keep you safe underwater. But many of those components are vulnerable to gunk and corrosive effects of salt water, which can silently wreak havoc if left unchecked. Imagine leaving your BCD in a damp corner after a dive and finding it covered in mold and probably smelling like something that came out of a garbage heap. This isn't just gross, it's potentially dangerous. As I went over in a prior video, that deadly fungus can grow in these conditions. And some issues with the BCD that could arise is that the internal bladder could stick together, springs inside the inflator buttons can malfunction, and before you know it, your fancy buoyancy issues are gear failures mid-dive. After your dive trip, before you go home, give your BCD a thorough rinse, and don't forget to clean the inside too. Make sure you get all the seawater out first, and then partially fill the BCD with fresh water through the inflator mechanism. To do so, you can hold the hose straight into the inflator or fill it up through a removed dump valve cover, which is often on the bottom here. Now, here's the crucial part. Give it a thorough shake to get the water around inside of it. Then, drain it through the dump valves This process flushes out the saltwater debris that could cause corrosion or valve malfunctions. You want to do this maybe 2 to 3 times, ideally. Then, after dumping it, inflate it orally one last time and let it dry somewhere that is not damp, is warm, and out of the sun. Once at home after your trip, before you store it for the long term, I recommend you get a bucket or use a bathtub and put the BCD to soak in there for at least 24-hour period to ensure all the salt water dissolves. Inspect it while it's in the tub too. I highly recommend you throw in some stearamine in there too and make sure that's getting into the water bladder, because that will just be some antibacteria that make sure the external, any mold that's been growing on it externally and internally, will get disinfected. But it's important to use something like stearamine, because stearamine is food grade disinfectant, meaning that it's actually safe to eat. Now, I don't recommend eating it. In fact, I don't know if you're not supposed to eat it, but it is safe to use on stuff you are going to eat with. So you could use it in a dishwasher or something. So that's the ideal kind of antibacterial to use. And stearamine just happens to be a quite popular thing to use on dive gears. So stearamine it is, and it's fairly cheap. After the bathtub experience and after it's dried, you then want to inspect it everywhere for rust corrosion, just like you did with your regulator. If there is any, break out that small toothbrush at the same time you're doing a regulator and get all that rust off there. Pay special attention if you're dealing with steel or aluminum or chrome, because like I said, you probably want different cleaners. It's much more common for the BCD to have more steel parts, particularly buckles and steel back plates. Just pay attention. You don't want to use steel rust cleaner on aluminum or chrome. It will cause damage. So just make sure you're using the least sensitive rust cleaner you can for your setup. I mean the most sensitive, or the least acidic to your gear setup. And chrome is going to be the most sensitive thing on your gear, so be extra sensitive with that stuff. And this includes even with vinegar. You may want to use something a little less acidic like phosphoric acid or just fresh water. There are specialized cleaners, like I mentioned, for chrome that make it a little bit easier. Like I mentioned, I usually use stuff that's safe for chrome and aluminum just so I have to think less about it. And I think I mentioned it, but make sure you don't get any rust cleaner on rubber or anything else. If you do splash it, just clean it off as quick as possible. It might be a good idea to have some baking soda mixed with a little bit of water, and this creates a material that will neutralize acid. So if you do splash on things you're not supposed to, having that ready will make sure you neutralize the acid of the splash. I'm not talking about like the movie Aliens kind of acid where it's going to be just destroying material right before your eyes. I'm talking about like if you just leave it on there for like 6 months, it's going to probably do something you don't want to. So it's not going to be like a fast burn, but you do want to remove it for sure. And I did mention a little bit, but for steel back plates and your scuba cylinders or tanks rather, you can use navel jelly if it's steel. If it's aluminum, don't use navel jelly, but steel stuff will be easier. Use navel jelly or something like that because it'll just remove the rust fairly easily, but only use it on steel. So it's very important to know what the rust looks like. Remember that grayish dulling is usually aluminum or chrome, and the reddish brown color is usually steel. I also want to advise to not use chemicals or petroleum-based products on your BCD that can damage the materials as well. Stick to mild BCD safe cleaners and antibacterial if you're using more than just water to clean the non-metal parts of your BCD. And once you've derusted it, it might be good for one more rinse. Then hang your BCD partially inflated somewhere cool in a shaded area out of direct sunlight, because direct sunlight will degrade the materials significantly, leading to premature wear and tear, which we want to avoid with our preemptive maintenance. So keep it out of sunlight as much as you can. And the partial inflation prevents the internal bladder from sticking together. Make sure it's completely dry before storage to prevent any mold or mildew growth. And before you use it next, check for fraying along the straps, which you can usually burn with a lighter to smooth it out. Check the valves. See if they're damaged and that they're tight. Sometimes they will loosen up and could fall off, and that's not a surprise you want while diving. And then also check for any other signs of wear, just in case you did a sloppy job of cleaning it. It happens to everyone, so if you cleaned it thoroughly, it's probably fine, but inspect to be sure. These small issues can become big problems if left unchecked. Your scuba cylinder is literally the thing keeping you alive underwater, but many divers overlook its care, and that could lead to expensive and very ugly mistakes. Of course, if you use rental tanks, this is a little bit less of a concern, but make sure you do your due diligence to clean those tanks, and this section will prepare you for owning your own. And if a cylinder is not maintained well, it could be your next rental tank, which could potentially lead to problems. So owning your own gear sometimes brings a peace of mind, but of course you don't really travel with cylinders, so this is more for local diving, of course. Cylinder maintenance is just as crucial as other parts of your kit. Thinking of your cylinder as a pressure cooker for your life support system, it's constantly under immense stress, holding air at incredibly high pressures. And your tanks will often take a beating. Being as heavy as they are, and any compromise in its integrity could spell a catastrophic failure. You want to keep it in good condition and keep your investment running for years to come. After every dive, give your cylinder a thorough rinse with fresh water, paying extra attention to the valve area. It's ideal to rinse it with the regulator on and still pressurized, but not necessary for the cylinder, more for the regulator as I mentioned earlier. Rinsing the tank helps prevent saltwater buildup that can corrode the metal. Of course, make sure you get the threads and the valve area, especially since those are pretty easy to miss along the little nooks and crannies of it. A spot many divers miss is under the boot. If you have aluminum tanks, guess what? You can just permanently remove that boot. It doesn't really do much good. If you have steel tanks, the tank is probably round on the bottom, so you probably want to keep that boot. But take the time to rinse that boot area thoroughly, more thoroughly than other parts, since it could take a little bit longer to get to salt water. If you take my advice earlier and just go ahead and leave the regulator on it and pressurize it and just put it in fresh water from time to time and keep it in there for several hours, that makes sure that the salt water will be removed. Store it where it won't receive saltwater spray in between dives, or prefer to put your regulator on and screw it in and ensure the salt water won't reach the area where your regulator is screwed in. This just helps protect the tank threads and your regulator threads from saltwater splash. Keep in mind, always before putting the regulator on, take a moment to inspect the valve and O-rings for any signs of damage or debris. A quick wipe with a clean, lint-free cloth can prevent particles from entering your regulator or damaging the O-ring. And it's worth noting that, remember, if you have a DIN regulator, the O-ring is of course on your first stage. If you have a yoke regulator, the O-ring will be on the tank. So if you're swapping tanks, it's more important to check that O-ring every single time. Of course, when you're back home and you're ready to give the thing a little bit more of a thorough cleaning, remove the tank boot and give the entire cylinder a good scrub with mild soap and water. You can soak it for several hours like I mentioned earlier to make sure you get all that salt water off as well. Pay special attention to any areas where salt might have accumulated and caused the corrosion. Once clean, dry it thoroughly to prevent any lingering moisture from causing corrosion. If you do cap the top, make sure the top is fully dried before putting on the cap, which, by the way, it's very common for individuals to put the cap on once it's filled, meaning that this tank is full and you take the cap off once it's been used. So if you're using it for the cap for that purpose, that signal, then just leave the cap off, it's fine. You can go ahead and remove the rust in the same way as the other parts of the gear, but of course, again, make sure you take note if it's an aluminum tank or steel tank and use the proper cleaners for those materials. Still, cleaning the tank from rust is relatively straightforward since its surface is often very broad. The hardest part will be the valve area, of course. Use that soft toothbrush and work in that rust remover, especially on the threads of the valve, particularly for the DIN tanks. And let's not forget about your other gear, like your mask, your dive computer, and camera. These also need some tender love and care after every dive. Make sure you rinse them with fresh water. Most dive boats or facilities will provide freshwater buckets that you can put these smaller items into. Often they will have 2 of these buckets, one for basically most of your gear and the other for dive masks. The reason why they have a separate one for dive masks is because maybe your mask has some mucus on it, and a lot of people don't like that getting into the expensive electronics. So understandable if there's 2 buckets, one for dive mask, everything else goes in the other one. Later, when you take your gear out, let it dry fully. Most of your gear is fine to just go ahead and pat dry with a towel, and even better if you can blow these with a power spray or a condensed air. And this is especially important for your electronics to have little screw areas, small little nooks and crannies. It's just really hard to get potentially all the salt water all those cracks. So pressurized air helps a lot. So after a little bit of a soak with those electronics, go ahead and use the air and get all of the water off the thing, just in case it's salt water. And this includes cameras and your torches. Anything that has pressurized buttons and a lot of small little screws or holes. Make sure to blow all these down and prevent the rust buildup. All right, time to talk about professional servicing. It's one thing I don't advise to skip and never ignore. Professional servicing can extend your gear's life and potentially save yours in the process. It's most commonly needed for your regulator and scuba cylinders. Pay special attention to how often your manufacturer recommends that you use these services. For cylinders, it's often a yearly visual inspection and a hydrostatic inspection every 3 to 5 years. You can only get a tank hydrostatically tested so many times as well. So it will have an inevitable amount of years until a tank can be retired. For cylinders, the date it's been last hydrostatic tested is literally stamped in the metal, usually at the top. So look for that and you can determine when you need to do it next. The regulator and visual inspection are often okay to just do yearly. Set a month and do it ritually, or do it before you dive for a trip after a long storage. You can be a little more intelligent about your regulator maintenance. You can buy a cheap IP gauge like the one I'm going to show you on screen, and put this into one of your hoses like a BCD inflator hose after your regulator is pressurized on a tank. You should see the IP gauge read from 135 to 145 psi, or 9 to 10 bar. If it's high or lower than that, it's time to get your regulator serviced. And by the way, those IP gauges are relatively cheap, so this test is fairly cheap and easy to do on your own. This way, if you're an infrequent or frequent diver, you now have a better rubric to follow for how often you need to service the regulator. When you take your gear to a certified technician, they don't just give it a once-over, they perform a thorough inspection, looking for signs of wear and tear that might escape the untrained eye. This includes checking for internal corrosion, examining seals and hoses for deterioration, and testing functionality of critical components. Keep in mind that even if your equipment seems to be working fine, hidden issues could be quietly developing. Usually, a visual inspection doesn't cost a thing, or is fairly cheap, cost ranging around 20 USD. And if the technician is willing, you might be able to be there and watch. If something is found, you'll have to pay for the repair, of course. By being there and being able to watch, this allows you to learn a thing or two about better maintaining your gear too. And even better if the technician will teach you a thing or two, which don't expect that part, but is always a nice to have. These professionals look at a lot more gear than you do. So when in doubt, utilize their professional opinions. Remember, every minute you spend maintaining your gear is a minute invested into your safety and enjoyment underwater. Follow these tips and you'll ensure your gear is as ready for your next dive as you are for years to come, and keeping minimal impact to your wallet. If you enjoyed this video and are interested more in BCDs or regulators, check out these 2 videos here, which will go into the details that I kind of glossed over in this video, and you'll learn a lot more about the anatomy and different styles of BCDs and regulators out there. Until next time.